Joining us in Washington to look a little closer, Jay Solomon. He's a Siegel Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Jay, it's great to have you with us. Before we talk, there's another development on what we just heard from Dan today. That is several countries sending a letter to the White House. That letter now made public, and ministers from those three countries are asking the U.S. to leave them out of secondary sanctions. They write, as allies, we expect the U.S. will refrain from taking action to harm Europe's security interests, and we expect that secondary sanctions won't be enforced on EU entities and individuals, and thus respect our political decision. Clear message from Europe.
Yes, Jay, do you think the Trump administration should grant the wishes of those European signatories to the deal for relief from sanctions? And do you think there's any chance of that actually happening?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter what I think. I don't think the Trump administration is going to grant these type of waivers writ large. Maybe there'll be a few cases where they do it, but this feels exactly like what was going on towards the end of the Bush administration and then early Obama administration, where the U.S. made it clear that they were going to essentially quarantine the international banking system away from Iran. And the Europeans were not happy about that. It's not like the Europeans jumped for joy when the Obama administration went down this road. It included sort of a gradual escalation where the U.S. did start sanctioning Iranian banks and companies to the tune of billions of dollars during the first term of the Obama administration in particular. And then you really did see the European come on board the financial war that eventually led to the nuclear agreement. So I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth. But I think that the fear in Europe of what happened in previous years is going to really limit the ability of the companies, the major companies, to go back in regardless of what their governments are saying. We've seen Peugeot, which has huge operations inside of Iran, Total, two French companies, both basically say they're pulling out because they cannot risk being on the wrong side of the U.S. Treasury. They can't risk losing access to the U.S. Economy. So I think in some ways what the governments themselves say in Europe is almost pointless, because the banks and the companies themselves can't afford not to have access to the U.S. financial system. And in the kind of broader scheme of things, Iran just isn't that big a market for them.
So, Jay, does it seem like these EU leaders are sort of chasing a train that has already left the station, that they cannot really stop the fallout from the U.S. withdrawing from the nuclear deal?
I mean, they can. I think a lot of what's going on is kind of diplomatic back and forth, too, between the Europeans and the Iranians. Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran has had a lot of meetings with the Europeans, basically saying, look, you need to lessen the financial pain for us if we're going to stay in this deal. He's been kind of globe-trotting to Asia as well to sort of say, look, if we're going to maintain the restrictions on our nuclear program, we're going to need financial incentives. And the supreme leader of Iran made a pretty hard speech this week where he basically said, look, if we don't get what we want, we're going to start expanding again our nuclear program. What I think is going on in a lot of ways is that, you know, the European Foreign Minister Mogherini are trying to say to the Iranians, stick with this deal. We'll limit the financial pain. And, you know, come the fall, there are going to be elections inside the United States. We think the Trump administration, the Republicans, will lose. And, you know, a next U.S. president in the U.S. could be a Democrat who would want to pick back up the deal. So I think they're trying to get the Iranians to weather the storm on the hope that Trump won't be elected and you'll see a Democrat in there who will go back into the agreement. But I think there's going to be that's a questionable approach, and I do think, you know, the Iranians are extremely vulnerable in their economy. Their currency has fallen by about a half over the past year in its value, and it's going to be difficult for them to wither this type of storm.
Heard a little bit about the repeated threats that Iran is making about what it could do next. This time today, it came with their ambassador to the UN's atomic watchdog. Here's a little bit of his comments in Vienna.
These are the preparatory works for a possible scenario if in an unfortunate situation, the JCPOA fails, then Iran can restart its activities without any limits that's already being under the JCPOA.
Well, let's go back to Washington and Jay Solomon, Siegel Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Jay, before the break, you said you believe it's going to be hard for Iran or the Iranian economy to weather the storm of these sanctions. But we're hearing defiance from Tehran now. Is that just bluster in your view?
I think the Iranians clearly are trying to drive a wedge between the U.S., Europe, and the other members that signed the JCPOA, and basically push the Europeans in particular to provide them a lot of economic incentives to stay in the deal. I think there's a real dilemma, I think, in Tehran, because, as I was mentioning before, their currency has lost in about 50% of its value over the past 12, 18 months. They've had rolling kind of protests, labor protests, protests against the economic stagnation. So for them to pull out and escalate on the nuclear side really risks exacerbating their economic troubles. And I think the Supreme Leader probably sees the economy, the currency, as in some way as an existential threat to that regime. So I think they're in a bit of a real dilemma. On the one hand, I think it's hard for them domestically to sort of be seen as staying in the deal if the U.S. is escalating the financial pressure. But at the same time, just to pull out, they could make it difficult for them to keep doing business with governments in Asia and certainly the Russians and the Chinese who probably aren't going to go along with the U.S. Financial war anyway. So I think the Iranian officials are definitely trying to stoke concerns in Europe. Whether they can make good on this escalation, I think, is a real question.
Jay, well, we're talking constantly, it sounds like, a negative view of the nuclear deal, meaning it really can't go forward after this point, after the U.S. withdrawal. But with that situation in Iran you described, that sort of economic desperation, could there be a silver lining there? Could this be an opportunity to actually even get a better deal?
It's a tough question. I'm personally pretty skeptical that this Iranian government would kind of crawl back into negotiations with the Trump administration. I think that's why there was some pretty legitimate criticism of why pull out if you're working with the Europeans to get tougher terms. So I think it's going to be pretty difficult to get this Iranian government back into a negotiation along the lines that we saw in 2013 through 2015. I think it's more likely you're going to see a return to this kind of a real standoff where the Iranians are going to, potentially take some steps to open or widen their nuclear program without sort of doing a mad dash for a weapon or at least the capability. And you'll see the Trump administration, kind of egging up this financial pressure. I'm still kind of watching the political cycle here, because President Rouhani in Iran made some interesting comments in the last few days where he's like, the Americans are having elections in the fall. We don't think Trump is going to be around forever. I would personally, I'm kind of watching the next, this summer up until these elections. I think you're going to see a lot of brinkmanship on both sides, and the Iranians trying to figure out if the Trump administration is really going to be around to stay.
Right. And in all of that meantime, in that interim, it doesn't seem that there's a very clear plan B, a clear alternative if the nuclear deal indeed does fall apart, as many, it seems, including yourself, think is in the cards. Jay Solomon.